hear us?
Yes.
Okay, so shall I begin? Everyone?
Yes, please.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all. Welcome to this session, Assessing Public Spending in the Water Sector and Addressing Financing Challenges, convened by the Global Water Practice of the World Bank. Let me introduce myself. I'm George Joseph, a senior economist in the Water Global Practice based in Washington, DC. In today's session, we will present the main takeaways from the recent World Bank report, Public Spending in the Water Sector, a Global Synthesis. This will be followed by a panel discussion in which we have experts from the water sector across the globe discussing various aspects of public spending in the sector. A Q&A session will follow for the audience to ask questions and share their comments. Along with me, the main presentation will be made by Ms. Aroha Bahuguna, Water and Sanitation Specialist and one of the lead authors of this report. Luis Alberto Andres, Program Lead and Lead Economist in the Latin America and Caribbean region of the World Bank, as well as a lead author of the report, will lead the panel discussion. You're welcome to send in your comments through the chat, available to all, and Yi Rong Hu Billy, also known as Billy, will be managing the chat. Could we move to the next slide? Before I begin, I would like to point out that this work is a result of a larger initiative by the Water Global Practice to undertake water sector public expenditure reviews across a number of countries, many of which are completed and a few are still ongoing. This synthesis report brings together the evidence on public spending on the water sector at the global and regional levels, using innovative methods and exploring several hitherto unexplored data sources. While to our knowledge, there are almost no estimates of public spending actual public spending in the water sector, there are a number of studies which have attempted to estimate the spending requirements in the WSS and irrigation subsectors separately. However, in the context of achieving SDGs, there is a need to assess the magnitude and trends of actual spending at the global level in comparison with the spending needs in the overall water sector and subsectors. Next slide, please. So what are the main questions that this report is investigating? First, we are examining how much is spent in the water sector and the subsectors annually. And second, what are the spending gaps in the WSS and irrigation sector? Third, the patterns of spending in the water sector, primarily focusing on the sources of spending and the components of spending. Then we move on to what are the levels of budget execution in the water sector to understand how the capacity of the sector to execute, to use available resources. And then we move on to efficiency to better understand efficiency in the sector, how efficient the public spending is in achieving the globally acknowledged or recognized targets, as well as how efficient the utilities are. And finally, we try to understand who benefits from the public spending in water, look at primarily examining the distributional aspects of public spending. Next slide, please. This report, to the best of our knowledge, is our first attempt to take an expansive approach towards understanding public spending in the whole of water sector, using several data sources, including budget data and national accounts. Mainly, there are 5 data sets used in this exercise, apart from the data from a number of data sources, such as World Development Indicators and the IMF. First is a Boost database, which is curated by the World Bank, that contains micro-fiscal data from more than 80 countries on fiscal data. We also tap into the Private Participation Infrastructure, or the PPI database, which is available for about 137 low and middle income countries from 1990 to 2020. With regard to investment in transportation, ICT, energy, and water. Then we also make use of the recently compiled SPI PPI database that combines investment data from the existing PPI databases and a new purpose-built data set on state-owned enterprises and public sector funded projects. We also use for aid data, we make use of the OECD creditor reporting system databases. And finally, on the utilities, water utilities, we make use of the International Benchmarking Network for Water and Sanitation Utilities, or the IBNet database. That is the world's largest database on water and sanitation utilities performance with data on 5,191 utilities for 151 countries from 1994 to 2020. Next slide, please. The dominant share of public sector in the public spending in the water sector, and thus of the role of the government in the water sector, is not surprising because of several unique features of the sector. First, water resources are of a common pool nature and face significant consequent challenges from over-extraction, leading to the tragedy of commons. This calls for regulatory interventions, and hence the role of the government. Access to water supply and sanitation is a merit good, meaning there are overall positive benefits to the community from widespread use of good quality water and sanitation facilities. Then again, service provision in the water sector is exceptionally capital intensive with a long lifespan characterized by high fixed costs and long payback periods. However, once the infrastructure is set up, the additional cost of providing service to an extra household is very small. And also, networked water supply provision is characterized by natural monopoly characteristics, which leads to failures of marginal cost pricing. Water and sanitation services are further characterized by network externalities in consumption, so that when more people are using these services, society as a whole benefits. So because of all these reasons, we see that the social benefits far exceed the private benefits, and there is a need for the government to come in. And water is a resource for which there exist significant challenges in establishing property rights. Thus, the conditions for efficient determination of prices through voluntary exchange of goods and services does not exist for the water sector. And this again calls for a critical intervention from the side of the government. Next slide. When we look at the historical role of water sector, before we begin, let me emphasize the centrality of water sector in economic development and all-round human progress. I know very well that this is not necessary for an audience such as this, who have been associated with the water sector in many ways as practitioners, activists, officials, and researchers. Water is the basis of all life on our planet. Since ancient times, the prosperity and well-being of the surrounding population was determined to a large extent by water availability. In all societies, from ancient to the modern times, water, both from water supply and irrigation and to flood management, were primarily provided by public financing, which was financed mostly through taxes and public debt. Even the experience of modern cities such as London, Paris, Philadelphia, and New York are testimonies of how a combination of public spending and regulatory measures were undertaken to ensure access to good quality water supply and sanitation services. Irrigation infrastructure, including flood management systems in most of the advanced world and many agriculture-dependent economies, such as China, India, and Russia, were funded primarily by the public exchequer. Next slide, please. So coming to the main questions raised earlier, how much is spent in the water sector by the public? The average total spending during the period 2009 to 2020 in the water sector was $164 billion in 2017 prices. This included public spending, official development assistance, and project level spending by public entities, state and local governments, state-owned enterprises, SOEs, and public-private partnerships. Public spending, as you can see, is the main source of funding in the water sector, constituting about 86% of the sector's total spending, followed by ODA and SOEs at a distant 6.9 and 5.9 respectively. While private sector account only for a mere 1.7% of the total spending. Next slide. On the total spending of 164 billion US dollars, 86% or roughly 141 billion is spent by the public sector. This is equivalent. So what does it mean in terms of the global public spending? This is equivalent to about 2% of the global public spending and 0.4% of the global GDP. Majority of the public spending, about 60%, is dedicated to human development sectors, which gives us the perspective on how much less is spent on the water sector. And even among the infrastructure sectors, public spending in the water sector is relatively lower compared to the transportation sector, which constitutes about 4% of total public spending, and energy that constitute about 5%. Next slide. Of the total spending in the water sector, the highest amount of spending, level of spending, is the EAP region, not the amount. The share of spending as a share of GDP is the highest in the EAP region and the lowest in the ECA region. One potential reason that could be attributed to this is that the ECA region infrastructure is already largely built up, and hence capital investments are relatively low. Next slide, please. When we look at the patterns of public spending, at the subsector level, WSS dominates. Water supply and sanitation dominates with 76% of all spending, while water transport comes second with about 16%. Irrigation comes to the third place. As expected, most of the public spending, about 64%, comes from the domestic sources globally. However, foreign funding is of critical importance to the water sector in sub-Saharan Africa. Next slide, please. Again, regarding the patterns of spending, majority of the spending in the sector, as expected, is capital spending. And this is the highest in the irrigation sector, subsector, followed by the WSS sector. Another important thing that we notice here in this analysis is an often cited fact about the water sector, that relatively low maintenance expenditures are made in the water sector. We have a culture of construction and non-maintenance, and in nearly all the subsectors, the maintenance expenditure is below 7%. Next slide, please. As we mentioned, ODA plays an important role in the water sector, particularly in countries where infrastructure is low. However, when you look at the ODA, only 5% or about 12 billion comes into the water sector, and the rest is moving to the other sectors. In fact, among the recipients, Sub-Saharan Africa dominates, with 25% of all ODA in the water sector is received by Sub-Saharan African countries. Next slide, please. Now, talking about private sector participation in the sector, of all funded invested by the private sector in infrastructure, only 3% in infrastructure sectors, only 3% goes to the WSS sector. For other subsectors such as irrigation, private sector participation is practically negligible in terms of infrastructure investments. Even in the WSS, of all the infrastructure investments, only 9% comes from the public sector, while the rest is contributed by the public sector and SOEs, which are generally dominated by the public funds. Next slide, please. We all know that water is in the forefront of our response efforts during the COVID crisis. However, available data shows that public spending in the WSS sector fell substantially by about 27% when compared to the pre-pandemic year. So this is something that was quite unexpected, but we also know that a large amount of funds was channelized to the health sector as well as social protection spending. but a fall in the water sector, particularly in WSS, is substantial. Next slide, please. So coming to the next question, what are the spending gaps in WSS? We utilize the costing estimates from Hutton and Verghese to come up with the gaps in spending in the water sector, which is basically the difference between the cost of providing certain prescribed levels of service as against what is actually being spent. From about 113 countries for which data is available, there is an overall spending gap of about 136 billion annually. As expected, the gap is highest in sub-Saharan Africa, followed by South Asia. Next slide, please. Compared to, again, when compared to the Rosenberg and Fay estimates of the actual spending needs in the irrigation sector, when comparing this with the actual spending in the irrigation sector, we see an annual spending gap of about $3.9 billion. This gap is highest in South Asia and Latin America, and followed by sub-Saharan Africa. It is also interesting to note that EAP and ECA regions are spending more than what is required annually in the irrigation sector. Now I will hand it over to Aroha to continue the rest of the presentation.
Thanks, George. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. So far, you've heard George present our findings on how much is spent by whom, the spending patterns, and the spending gaps in the sector. I will now take you through our findings, which focus on three questions, namely, of the budget allocated in the sector, how much is spent? 2, how efficient is spending in the sector? And 3, who benefits from the spending in the sector? So this first slide is on budget execution. And as you can see that of the budget allocated in the sector, over 1/4 of funds were not used for the period that we analyzed the data for. And this looks particularly bad when we compare it to other sectors such as human development and even other infrastructure sectors such as transport. Now, we know that low execution rates for a sector are a reflection of low absorptive capacity in the sector, for which the reasons are many. But one thing to note is that the income level of a country is not correlated with low budget execution. And we know this because we found high levels of budget deviations for a few years for high income and upper middle income countries that were similar to low income countries. So then what are the determinants of budget execution? Many have argued that economic performance of a country is related to the institutional and political environment of a country that promotes better economic performance. So to put that to the test, we analyzed 3 indicators. One was the governance effectiveness, second was state legitimacy, and the third was performance of political institutions. Now, to briefly define each of these, by governance effectiveness, we mean the quality of input required by the government to be able to produce and implement good policies and deliver public goods. State legitimacy refers to the corruption and representativeness of the government, the lack of which can undermine social contract and trust in the government. And third is the quality of political institutions, which refers to the freedom to effectively organize and participate in political processes. Through a series of econometric analyses, we found that improving these indicators was also correlated with improvements in budget execution. The second question is on efficiency. And to look at efficiency in the sector, we split it into 2 parts. So the first note here is that because of the lack of data in other subsectors, the focus here is on water and sanitation mainly. So the first part of efficiency is to look at the national level, how efficiently are water and sanitation access levels attained. And to do this, we examined data from Boost using national level data from 2009 to 2020. And here we see that the total factor productivity in providing basic water and sanitation services. And by basic water and sanitation, we're using the same definition as the JMP. The total factor productivity declined by 7%. And by that, or in other words, we mean that to produce using the same level of inputs in 2020 as in 2009, output decreased by 7%. Similarly, for piped water and sewer network access, the total factor productivity decreased 6% during the same period. The second part of the question deals with utility level data, or how efficient are utilities in delivering water services. And to do this, we looked at data from IBNet, which, as George has explained earlier, is the largest aggregator of utility data in the world. So here again, you see that the technical and cost efficiency are not at their optimum level. So the median technical efficiency is at 74%, or with a given level of inputs, the output is only 74%. Similarly, the median cost efficiency is around 85%, showing significant room for improvement. Again, to note here is that these are median levels of efficiency. So there's wide heterogeneity in country level data and utility level data. And finally, we come to the question of equity. Subsidies are at the heart of this question, and subsidies are frequently used to help address gaps in affordability while addressing the objectives of cost recovery and efficiency. So overall, with the exception of a few countries such as Vietnam and Dominican Republic, a higher proportion of rich households receive water subsidies compared to poor households. And this is especially true in sub-Saharan Africa. And why is this so? And that's because richer households are more likely to be connected to network services than poor households. And network services are the ones that receive subsidies. To look at this issue of wealth, access by wealth and location further, we have the next two slides, the first of which looks at wealth. Here you will see two graphs. The first one is on access levels for water, basic water, and the second one on the right-hand side is access levels for basic sanitation. So as you can see, at every level of spending per capita on WSS, the richer quintiles are likely to have higher access compared to poorer quintiles. But it is also true that as spending per capita increases, the poorer households gain access. And for water especially, they're able to decrease the gap almost completely, except the poorest quintile, which then has implications for last mile delivery. For basic sanitation too, the poorer households are able to catch up, but the gap is not as small as water. Location of residence is another source of exclusion from economic opportunities and access to services, including water and sanitation. Again, you see on the top, you have piped water access, and in the bottom graph, you have sewer access. Again, at every level of spending per capita on WSS, urban households are more likely to have higher access compared to rural households. As spending increases, rural households catch up, but not as much as the urban households. And in fact, the gap widens at the highest levels of spending, which means that more targeted interventions for rural areas is warranted. Having taken you through all these findings, what does it mean for policy recommendations? So we humbly put forward 3 recommendations, prefacing it by saying that we know that not all of these will work for every situation, and no single one is a silver bullet. So they have to be put into action in a combination. So the first one is to improve utilization and efficiency of public funds, which has 3 threads. The first one is improving public investment management by streamlining decision-making at every level of project cycle, from project preparation to implementation to completion and evaluation. The second is reforming public financial management, which refers to the flow of funds within the government machinery. One of the main reasons attributed to the low execution rate is the unpredictability of funds and the delay in funds. So improving PFM is part of the solution. In addition, it has to be noted that water investments are capital intensive and have a longer time horizon. So they need a longer frame of budget planning, and there should be a focus on multi-year programs. Finally, there should be a realistic performance metric for SOEs and public entities. As we have seen in earlier slides, it's the public sector or the government and SOEs that is the dominant provider of services in the sector, which means that they often have to juggle the twin considerations of efficiency and equity. And equity implying that they may have to expand services to areas that are unprofitable, or they may have to answer to higher development objectives such as employment generation and so on. So there needs to be a performance metric that goes beyond considerations of efficiency alone. The second recommendation is on catalyzing the flow of long-term financing through institutional and regulatory reforms. Recent research has shown that the presence of a credible and independent regulator which can determine tariffs and service standards does more to improve performance in the sector than the ownership of the provider. So this can also help, these reforms can also help utilities to borrow from the financial market. And finally, reforming the water sector itself for more and better public spending. So the first one here is cost recovery and demand management to reduce costs. We have talked a lot about tariffs and tariff revision for cost recovery, but that is not the only tool in our arsenal. We can also reduce costs through such measures as undertaking timely maintenance and efficient use of inputs such as energy, and demand management measures through the adoption of combination of pricing schemes and behavior change initiatives to help reduce costs. The second is on improving state capacity through institutional policy reforms, as well as targeted capacity building initiatives, such as professionalization of service delivery to support the service providers' access to commercial finance. And then finally, which we cannot emphasize enough, is improving data access and transparency. This was brought home to us, especially while undertaking this exercise on the public expenditure review, that data often is not available in a disaggregated enough form. And where it is available, it is often riddled with inconsistencies, inaccuracies, and incompatibilities. Especially for a sector like water, which is spread across multiple ministries and agencies, for us to be able to better understand spending in the sector, we need to have access to better data. And improving data quality will go a long way in improving the sector. With that, I will end here and pass on the baton to my colleague, Luis, who will moderate the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Rojas. Thank you, George. Impressive work. Congratulations to you both and the team behind this, because this is definitely not a minor achievement. So perhaps I'm tempted to share some reactions, right? I mean, I think that I want to again recognize the massive work, the titanic work that you guys did. I mean, this kind of endeavor, whenever we have this conversation a couple of years ago, was kind of a long shot in terms of how far we can go in this topic, even whenever the questions are hyper relevant. Eventually, the bottleneck is right. I mean, I'm glad that you guys deliver on this important piece. I have very important facts that you are bringing to the table, and definitely, I trust that this will be a lasting story for us in the sector. Perhaps a couple of things that eventually got my attention. I mean, definitely the limited level of investment that we have at this stage vis-a-vis to the actual gap is striking. The fact that you saw and compute this $164 billion in total investment, of which the majority of this is coming from the public end, is not surprising, but definitely something that we need to better understand in terms of, in one hand, how we can do more with the same, or more with more, ideally, but also how we can bring the private sector back to the sector, right? And that's something that eventually is still for the sector a pending task, with few exceptions. The other story that I brought my attention was what you mentioned about the lack of focus on maintenance, right? I mean, and eventually, construction neglect and reconstruction rather than construction and maintenance. That should be far more efficient, as Aroha mentioned at the end. That will be far more cost effective. So that probably, I mean, I don't want to abuse the holding the mic. So let me pass to the panel, the distinguished panel that we have at this stage. I will introduce them first, and then I will start passing some round of questions to the students. First, we have Guy Houghton, is a development economist. He covers the knowledge and development and management for UNICEF WASH section globally, as well as the implementation of the WASH bottleneck analysis tool, WASH financing strategies, and the development of a global monitoring framework for WASH affordability for the joint monitoring program. Probably another feature of Guy that he's a good friend. We have been working together for many years, so I'm pleased to have Guy again in this session. We have Sophia Murat. Sophia has been consulting as a technical officer with UN Water Glass at WHO in Geneva since 2018. In her role, she contributes to GLASS data collection and analysis on a national system to support WASH, including governance, monitoring, human resource, and finance. She also provides technical support to national government developing WASH accounts using the tracking methodology to track financial flows and expenditure on WASH. Pascaline, colleague from the World Bank too. Pascaline, when she's a senior water supply and sanitation specialist at the World Bank. She's based in the Nairobi office. She has over 10 years of experience in the water sector with particular focus on water supply, sanitation, and hygiene. Pascaline is part of the World Bank Global City-wide Inclusive Sanitation team that supports both the incorporation of city-wide inclusive sanitation knowledge into operations, as well as the development of new knowledge and initiatives in different countries. So with that, probably I would like to hear from the three of you as a first sort of a couple of minutes in terms of reaction to what you heard from Maroja and George, and your comments. I mean, what are the things that draw your attention on the presentation? Let me perhaps go in the same order, 2 minutes each, and then we have with some more specific questions. So, Guy?
Thank you so much, Luis, and thank you, George and Aroha, for the great presentation and this great study. It's extremely comprehensive, what you've achieved, and useful. I think it's pure magic how you've pulled data from so many countries with diverse data sets and different years, and turn them into these graphics which are very understandable and they tell a clear picture. I think there's a lot to unpack here in the future, so we really need to make use of all the work you've done in future sort of publications and events. So I'll keep my comments short, but I think we're missing part of the picture in terms of the household spending, and I'm sure Sophia may say some words about that, because the GLASS data sets do ask questions about tariffs and what households pay, because that's an important part of the picture. And also, I would have thought the private sector investment might be higher than 2%, and I'm wondering whether the tools you have for collection would actually capture all the private sector investments going on. But just moving to the overall result, 164 billion, I imagine that's not just investment, that's also sort of to cover a lot of operation cost of utilities and other government programs. But you know, I think that's a very large number, and when compared to the capital requirement we have of 114 billion a year, I think we can no longer say we need to increase spending by 3 or 4 times, maybe more a doubling. But so I think that's optimistic in one way. But of course, those resources are very unequally distributed across countries. So there'll be major sort of amounts coming from China and India and other sort of countries making investments, and they'll be very low for other countries. So we really need that breakdown by country and by region. I think I'm very interested in the factor productivity estimates you've done. I think that must be very challenging to do. But I'm wondering whether it's declining because you're over the last 10 years, you've been reaching the harder to reach with basic services, possibly, making it more expensive per household reached. So in terms of the conclusions, I totally agree. I think we need to work on budget execution. Other sectors achieve a much higher percentage, so I'm sure we can move the needle on that. And also the redistribution of subsidies. We all know it should be done. And remembering your publication, Louise, from a few years ago, which really told the story on that. And I'm wondering if it's happening and continues to happen because a lot of those subsidies are coming from municipal level. And so you can't sort of redistribute municipal funds over to rural area. So maybe that needs to be sort of investigated more. In terms of moving forward, because I might not be able to conclude this in my other questions, I think we've got to, in terms of financial tracking in the sector, we've got to work as sort of international agencies to make sure that we're giving countries the right tools, easy to implement, and that we can have more regular updates, and not sort of every 5 or 10 years for some countries, but moving it to every 1 or 2 years, so that we sort of strengthen that function in governments. So we've got to argue more for the value of having regular financial tracking. And of course, national governments do have their own data. We just got to ensure that it's made more transparent and sort of represented in a standard way for sort of national and international audiences. But thank you for the chance to comment on the study. Back to you, Louise.
Thank you, Guy. Sophia.
Thanks, Luis. And first of all, I guess I would just say congratulations to George and Aroha. This is really a fantastic study. I, from working with WASH accounts, know how expenditure data is difficult. So it's really impressive that you've been able to pull together so many different types of data sources and really compile a complete picture for the water sector overall. I think, you know, speaking from my subsector of WASH and from that perspective, I think we see similar findings in our WASH accounts, with public spending favoring wealthier and urban populations. This is overall what we've found in our national studies. And I think, you know, very much that's in line. As Guy noted, you know, there is this component of the household expenditures missing from this piece of work. Notably, you're working on a broader sector, not just WASH, which I guess is the benefit of working in a subsector like I do. But, you know, very much that we need to also consider the contribution of tariffs and out-of-pocket expenditures to specifically O&M for the WASH sector. I think just from the WHO perspective, I found the finding on the pandemic, you know, maybe not surprising that there's lower expenditures on public expenditures on WASH and on irrigation during the pandemic period. I think, you know, possibly it may very well be that some of that health sector spending went to, you know, capital investments in infrastructures and WASH and healthcare facilities, those types of expenditures that we maybe weren't able to capture, but are somewhat, you know, WASH adjacent and perhaps are including components of strengthening infrastructure in healthcare facilities. But that's not to say that spending towards, I think, households was not negatively affected. That may very well be the case for the water sector. And then, you know, finally, I just say that the policy recommendations, I think, are very concrete and actionable, and, you know, something we need to follow. And I'll just echo the final recommendation about the data availability and transparency, which is always a challenge, and especially when you're talking about financial data. So really, congratulations to you all. I think it's a really excellent study. Over.
Excellent, Sophia. Pascaline, your reactions.
Thanks, Luis, and I will also start by congratulating my colleagues, George, Aroha, and everyone who have worked on this. I must say that Kenya is one of the recipients of this work. Kenya was part of the countries that underwent this public expenditure review, but it's still amazing to see, especially the messages put together, and to see how Kenya is not, the messages for Kenya are not necessarily different from other countries. So congratulations for that, George. So a few things struck me. Of course, again, I've been.
Noadi, give me David, and then take.
Sorry, I think someone. Can I go on? Okay. All right. Yeah. So a few key messages that struck me. I wouldn't say that the findings are necessarily very new. It's things that we mostly know from now talking also in relation to Kenya. We mostly know are happening, but putting the numbers and to it is what is amazing. As George was talking about public spending and public financing, and the fact that the gap is high, and we still expect that the funds should come from the public. We just went through an exercise that I will perhaps be able to talk a little bit about more in Kenya. And yes, you realize the reality of it, that for universal coverage, if I will focus more on water supply sanitation, universal coverage, we need more, more public spending to happen. But we are also seeing a case where budget execution is low, and there are a lot of inefficiencies that that countries like Kenya should be working on. I was actually reminded of the fact that in Kenya, everyone gets excited to say that access to safe and affordable water and sanitation is a basic right enshrined in the Constitution. So it's easier to say, and there was a lot of pressure on government to increase financing for water and sanitation, because then everyone feels they have the right to this service. But in actual fact, it definitely costs and matters. So should the government continue to increase the financing, whereas we also have other opportunities for improving, for instance, in terms of the efficiency. So I very much identify with also the recommendations, particularly on improving efficiency, both for identifying how to deal with these implementation bottlenecks. Other sectors are doing better than water. It's really would be good to know, as a follow-up to this work, what exactly are the key issues, and how will this work help to unblock these bottlenecks so that the sector performance is improving. Our colleagues have already talked about the fact that capital investments vis-a-vis maintenance, for instance, and the fact that we construct today, tomorrow, because the maintenance is not followed on thoroughly. The one opportunity that I definitely do see, and coming out very well from the presentation also, is the opportunity to improve efficiency of service providers, and to be able to generate additional resources that and definitely help out with the public spending gap that is already identified. On the question of equity of expenditure, I think it's time to really, all of us, identify how do we make sure that we do not continue with this trend of subsidies going, investments and subsidies going to the urban and to the rich and to the higher quintiles, and refocusing that. And I think performance-based financing is one of the opportunities that I would say that is important to really ingrain into the sector, to make sure that the sector is not only focusing on the easier to reach and forgetting to give the subsidies where they are mostly needed, and definitely the improvement in efficiency of the service providers creates an opportunity for leveraging more private sector financing. I'll stop that there for now. coming later. Thank you.
Thank you, Pastor. No, thank you again for your detailed comments. I mean, definitely you three have a ton of experience. I mean, I'm getting your positive reaction. I mean, definitely it's hitting the team that they are in the right direction, right? I mean, on this work. So let me go for a second round of questions for each of you. Guy, well, we have a long history, right? I mean, probably too long. And some of the challenges that we tend to have is basically data, right? I mean, and the data constraints that we tend to have. I mean, this work basically built on some of the seminar work that you did that was quite influential for the sector in terms of the cost for achieving the SDGs, right? But this data is from 2015, and the underlying data is getting older than that. How relevant these figures are? I mean, do we still should be quoting the same numbers or giving sort of a new iteration to that? How do you think that this can be improved? Right? How a few countries have been producing their own estimates and using the same methodology that you propose. Can this done in a different fashion? I mean, what would be your suggestions? Back to you.
Great, thank you, Luis. Yes, that study has followed me around, and it's great that it's still used. But yes, a study that is 6-7 years old, based on data that is older, is maybe not the best, numbers that we could have. But it's all we have at the moment. So there's a recent book published by Elsevier around what are secure investments, and I wrote a chapter which summarized all the sort of available cost estimates, and anything since that study has actually drawn on that study. So I keep telling people who want to do updates, try to get your own unit cost estimates, because these unit cost estimates are really, really old now. So that's my message. We do. I don't know if we need a comprehensive global study or we need just more good country studies. A recent update we did just for sanitation to be published in the State of the World Sanitation Report in 2020. We did a rerun of the numbers for sanitation and found almost the same number, $69 billion per year needed for safely managed sanitation. So I'm not sure if recranking that wheel will change the numbers considerably. However, because we're backsliding, we're not sort of on track in most countries for the safely managed standard, we have fewer years to achieve it. So the average per year needed will go up over time. And also we have to consider sort of various additional issues that are now really being considered by everyone, such as climate resilience. So how much more does it cost to achieve climate resilient services? And then we can also add on, say, affordability angle. So if we have these unit costs, how are they going to be financed? And then we can sort of cross-tabulate with the numbers from this study we presented today, to say, roughly what is the subsidy needed for populations to gain access. So I think a new study could add new angles, but my message is that countries, I think, have already made some of their own estimates. The tool you mentioned, the SWA tool, sort of with World Bank, UNICEF input, has been applied by about 40 countries. And but I see the analyses done by countries, and not many change the unit cost estimates, because it's hard that there aren't many studies that show the full economic cost of providing a service. They may have prices, they may have sort of government sort of benchmarks, but not many are fully costed. And so that's something we can improve on in the coming years, to really know what is needed in order to achieve a certain standard that is being targeted by a country. So yeah, I mean, I'm not asking for us to do more global studies necessarily, but might be useful sort of halfway through the SDG period. But I think our effort should be on supporting countries in their national financing strategies based on good cost estimates.
Excellent. Fully agree with you guys. like always. Sophia, can you speak about your experience with the WASH account? How this initiative can come to be, the challenges that you face in recording and verifying data, and how it can be used, has been used to address policy questions?
Sure, Luis, thank you for the question. I think, I alluded to this a little bit earlier, but in our work with developing WASH accounts, we've found a lot of interesting lessons learned. And WASH accounts essentially are accounts that track expenditures to water, sanitation, and hygiene. And they were developed sometime around 2012, I believe, to kind of address this realization that there's these large gaps in our knowledge and in our ability to track expenditures and develop these national accounts. So the methodology is called TrackFin, Tracking Finance, and it was developed in order to be able to develop these accounts based on experiences in the health sector for their equivalent health accounts. So I think with developing these WASH accounts, there's a few different differences that I guess are important to point out. As we alluded to earlier, the WASH accounts are developing accounts that include not only public expenditures, but also, household expenditures through tariffs or out-of-pocket expenditures. So it's really a holistic picture in usually a national level. Sometimes we do the exercise for specific states or, larger regions in certain countries. And in that way, we're able to create this holistic picture, very similar to the presentation that we just received from George and Aroha, showing us kind of an aggregate summary of what the expenditures are for water, sanitation, and hygiene. So far, we've done this exercise in, I think, about 25 countries that have implemented at least one cycle. And I guess, building on what we've been saying, this isn't something that just is done once and then ends. It needs to be something that's, continued on, integrated into national monitoring systems, and really an exercise that we can just continue to roll on and understand the data that we have and kind of take some policy action based on the results. So a lot of these countries have been using the WASH accounts results to improve their monitoring, to generate a more realistic picture of WASH expenditures, advocating for resource mobilization, or setting specific targets on spending. I think, Guy, I even had a country asking me about costing estimates after seeing their WASH accounts results, wanting to know, well, how much will this cost? And we're spending this much, but how much do we need to be getting our costs up in order to reach our national targets? So there's a lot of case uses and different ways that countries have been integrating the WASH accounts results, not only into their policy and planning processes, but also into their target setting and international commitments. For example, Angor commitments and tracking. But in terms of challenges, I guess I also alluded to this earlier, but financial data is quite sensitive, and it's not always easy even to get data from development partners. And I think Aroa was mentioning, the difficulty in being able to disaggregate this data to the subsector that you need. With WASH accounts, we find often that sanitation and hygiene data is also often quite convoluted, and it's hard to tease apart, which expenditure was going to a sanitation project as compared to hygiene projects. So collecting the data and disaggregating it and teasing it out is quite difficult. And then I think on a larger scale, just institutionalizing this is quite difficult, working with ministries of finance to really ensure that they understand what the data is going to be used for and what it is we're asking in order to create these accounts. So we'll continue working with you and our colleagues at the World Bank and you, Guy, to make sure that, you know, our exercises are complementing one another. And hopefully by looking through these, you know, public expenditures on the water sector overall and looking a little bit more into some of the costing exercises that countries can be doing, we can support them in really utilizing these results and making some big changes following these policy efforts. Over.
Excellent. Thank you, Sophia. Very, very insightful. Pascaline, you have a ton of experience in Africa. I mean, we love to hear your stories about Kenya, I mean, and your experience with the project. One point I would be interested to hear from your end is this pressure that we have in terms of how higher standards, right? I mean, higher standards in a region that is already have high coverage make a lot of sense. In a region like Africa or some countries that you have been dealing with that have a lower sort of coverage, maybe more possible, right? So I'd like to hear from you in terms of what are the implications of having higher level goals and targets such as a safely managed water and sanitation, etc., when a large population, a large share of the population in the country is still struggling with basic access, right? I mean, do these targets favor wealthier and denser neighborhoods where it's easier and cheaper to provide network services as opposed to rural areas? What are your reflections about this tension between standards and coverage, perhaps? Pascaline.
Yeah, interesting question, Luis, and I guess perhaps different people will have different perspectives on this. Yeah, working in Kenya and for countries like Kenya, where we didn't get close to achieving the MDGs, then we have a new commitment, and yes, definitely the country has signed off to these SDGs, and we know very well that we have upped the game when we're talking of higher targets here. But the reality, just like as you've mentioned, we are battling with first getting people from down the ladder, right? From, we are talking of, for the case of Kenya, for instance, where only like 60% of the population have access to basic water, or 30% access to basic sanitation. Not only that, the change from in the last decade has been, particularly for sanitation, has been minimal, and now they have to have higher targets. And a very small percentage is currently, and we can imagine where this percentage is that has access to safely managed sanitation. So yes, it becomes, and this is a conversation that we have had with government counterparts in Kenya, in Africa, on where do we start? Do we aim for the higher goal and more or less continue at the risk of neglecting those who do not have access in the first place, or do we focus first on moving the masses, or like basic minimum, ending open defecation? If you ask me, are higher goals good? I will say yes, but I think it really depends on how they are embraced and the approach that each government embraces or uses to get to those higher goals. For the case of Kenya, the government continues to commit to first getting people access to improved sanitation, improved water. So that is their goal for 2030. So the approach is trying to get the masses that are down there, down the ladder, up. So is moving the masses up the ladder. But I think there is also a great opportunity, if you ask me, to leapfrog, for instance. Do we have to use a particular approach or technology because we know that is the safely managed sanitation, whereas we also have an opportunity to get into the goal without necessarily, for instance, using very expensive centralized sewer system. So there is also that opportunity. So that is why I would say that it really depends on how the goals are embraced. If you look at it, that first we need to focus on ending open defecation, basic minimum, but also all our next goals, we will also ensure that we use the opportunity to do it once and for all. If safely managed can be achieved without necessarily going through small steps, then so be it. So I think it's an interesting debate, but it also really depends on how each country embraces it, and also financials. It's not only the country; it's also like us, the World Bank in this case. How do our projects make sure that we are not continuing to entertain focusing on fewer rich because we are aiming for safely managed sanitation. Thank you.
Thank you, Pascaline. Fully agree with you too. Definitely a concept that I always like whenever we are talking about the SDGs is this concept of ladder, right? So people should be climbing the ladder. I mean, and eventually you always have some tension between providing more people with basic stuff vis-a-vis to fewer with the higher standards, right? But definitely it's a debate that is subject to context, but definitely an important debate to have. Sophia, Guy, Pascaline, I want to thank the three of you. Your comments were great. I mean, and your experience, I mean, and this is quite unique. So definitely very, very useful for us for this discussion. And again, I want to thank the three of you for your insights and support to this venture, right? So now I want to shift gears a bit. We have a few minutes left. We got some questions that I want to make for George and Aroha. Feel free to keep shooting questions. I mean, we are trying to manage some of the questions so we can have a constructive discussion. I mean, I'm getting George and Aroha with some additional insights. So let me post a couple of questions to George and Aroha and take it from there. Sure, Aroha, definitely this effort is data-driven, right? I mean, you guys have been doing a massive effort in terms of collecting different sources, harmonizing the data, checking for the consistency. Definitely there is some gaps here and there that we need to fill it up. I mean, eventually you did an amazing job on that. But I wanted you to further discuss in terms of data reliability, right? I mean, and what are sort of the limitations that you can claim out of the data that you have been using? I mean, and some warning words for whoever wants to use this data for that. So probably, I don't know, Aroha or George, if you want to react to that.
Hi, Luis. Yes, I can go first, and I can talk about the IBNet database because that's what I have worked with quite a bit. So yes, data reliability and data consistency has always been, with any data exercise, that's the one question you get. But as they say, if you need a starting point. So without data, you cannot do anything. So you cannot manage what you cannot measure. So having at least a starting point for utility level data where you have at least some notion of what the coverage is, what the cost recovery is a starting point. With that said, we have a series of measures where we try to filter the data based on the countries, based on whether they're reporting recently or whether they've reported in the recent past or not. As well as some of the indicators that they've reported on. We do some basic consistency checks on whether an indicator is sort of speaking to another one that is a similar indicator or not. So we have all these checks of reliability and consistency, and then we filter out completely data that doesn't make sense. So we do have some checks like that.
Excellent.
So just to add to what Aroha was saying, again, for the boost data, which is the database that we used for budget numbers, basically statistics on data on how much is spent in the sector by the different national governments. We relied on the boost data, which is an effort by the bank governance practice to collect data, national level, national budget data, and harmonize them. So this is an effort that has been ongoing for a few years now. And so that's one of the main databases that we have used. Still, we try to check for consistency, as I was mentioning, by looking if there are any outliers, any major differences in trends, or anything that's surprising. And then we try to cross-check with the post team as much as possible. So from our side, we have done extensive checks on this. On the SPI, on the PPI database, which is again relates to the question that that was raised by Guy about, or one issue that Guy was raising, I think, about the share of the private sector. So this is the data that comes from the public-private partnership database that's basically collecting data at the project level. Whenever there is a project that is announced or publicized in the newspapers or somewhere else, that data is collected and then additional information is sought and then brought together. But this data undergoes a rapid or frequent updations changes because of many reasons. One, some of these projects which are started may not continue, or which are there in the purview of the or being registered may not really happen, and so on and so forth. A lot of things happen. So you see frequent revisions to this database. So what we have used is the latest version of the data. And so when we compare it with the earlier release of 2011, that is quite different. So I'll stop here. So these things happen. So yeah, I'll stop here.
Excellent, George. This is very, very useful. Perhaps another question from the audience, and probably George, you may want to react first. How does the choice of technology investment affect the trends and patterns on water sector spending? Meaning, do we have a potential access gap between rich and poor? Do we continue investing in the same technologies or bring new technologies? Perhaps some reflections on that for you in particular.
Yeah, when we look at the spending, we find it difficult to distinguish on which technology the money is being spent. It's quite difficult to distinguish unless there is specific information on that. However, we are trying to compare the service levels, which essentially entails the underlying technology. For instance, for whether it is a sewer connection or whether it is reducing open or basic sanitation. So this is basically measured in different ways by the different data sets. For instance, JMP reports this information, or national surveys report this information from which we collect this data. So the service level information is, or the indicators constructed are comparable across the different countries. What is being spent in each country is difficult to distinguish. Whether it is spent for sewer versus reducing open defecation, it is not clearly understood from or clearly deciphered from the budget spending data. I'll stop here.
Okay, excellent. Another question from the audience. I mean, and probably we go also perhaps now Aroha and then George. There is basically you have been doing a lot of work. I mean, you are disseminating part of the work in this event, but what other dissemination forms are you having in the pipeline, if any? And also perhaps what is next? How you think this work being influential to some of the country engagement? What do you think that will be the coming activities that will be the spillover of this work?
Thanks, Luis. So yeah, we do have a few dissemination activities lined up. So we plan to socialize the messages of the findings throughout the World Bank, and then eventually probably to some of the country management units where we did the country level engagements. So we would like to socialize the messages to clients as well, and to policy practitioners through just having brown bag lunches and so on. We also will be publishing the report soon, in a month or so, and we will have a few blog posts to publicize that. And so the idea is for it to reach a wider audience than just the World Bank. and reach the broader audience. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, just to continue on that, again, we are looking forward to, again, publicizing, not publishing the report, as well as a number of several background papers, technical papers that have gone into that are underlying the main findings of this report, which provide a lot of detail about the methodology which others can replicate. And we'll also be publishing the data soon that's available. Once we do the field checks and so on and so forth, we will soon have it published in one of the World Bank databases, so this can be used by wider public. And other dissemination through conferences, seminars, etc. We look forward to doing that as well.
Excellent. Thank you, George. I mean, and I want to suggest the audience that whoever wants to get some more detailed presentations on this that reach you both directly in case that to give more detailed analysis, or even the opportunity to present this to some other forums too, right? So
absolutely.
We have only 5 minutes left, so I wanted to give you perhaps the last words for your reflections. I mean, probably 1 minute each, no more than 2, in terms of what are the main takeaways that you have from this venture, and perhaps one recommendation that you would like to get to pass to some other followers of this work. What will be the main recommendation, the main tip that you can provide to whoever wants to do a public venture review? George, you first, and then Aroha.
Thank you, Luis. First, again, thank you very much to you, Luis, and all the panelists, Guy, Pascaline, and Sophia, for joining this discussion today, and for your wonderful comments and suggestions. We really appreciate them, and we really are glad that this report resonates with all you in different ways, and we are on track. So I think one recommendation I have for people who are doing public expenditure reviews is that for the water sector, so what we did in this exercise, this again a kind of a comprehensive report which combines the different data at the global scale. But country level studies, we try to combine the different sectors. And as Pascaline and Guy and others were mentioning, the sector is so fragmented, so data is very difficult to get, and that even sanitation data might sit with the water ministry or the health ministry or with some other ministry. So it's all quite difficult to come up with. So we have come up with a method of identifying, using, how do we use if you have the boost or some kind of budget databases, how do we use the administrative accounts, the functional accounts, and program accounts, and so on and so forth, the budget, and use that to classify, construct water sector and the water subsectors. So these kind of things we have developed, and that I think would make life easier for others who are doing this. And one additional important point that I want to mention, Luis, I hope I will not be overstepping my time limit, is to talk about the importance of public investment management and the need to focus again and again on public sector, because we have been devoting a lot of attention on private sector, and private sector, as we saw today, is only contributing in merely 2% of the total expenditure in the sector. So I'm not saying that the public sector doesn't have a role. It should go up. The level of spending that they have should go up. At the same time, the majority spender has to improve. The public investment management has to be improved in substantial ways, because we know that we are asking for more on the one side, but execution is suffering. So I think that's an important step that we should do in all countries if possible. And we have started some exercise in this regard in Bangladesh at this point, looking specifically, try to understand the water sector investments and water sector projects, and understand why they are having delays, why they are not spending the resources they have, and so on. So we are doing this exercise as we speak right now.
Excellent.
I'll stop here.
Thank you, George. Aroha, 1 minute for your final reflections and tips.
Thanks, Luis. So my one tip would be focus on data. As we found out in this exercise, data is extremely important, but also extremely fragmented. And we have used a huge number of data sets, and this is the first study of its kind that uses that many data sets. But one thing that Sophia had mentioned is the use of household expenditure, which I think in the next round maybe it might be useful to include that to get a more holistic understanding of the expenditure in the sector, because especially in sanitation, households do spend quite a bit from their pocket. So that would be one tip. And then I think it's also important to focus on budget execution, because we can all talk about increasing flow to the sector, and that's all very well and good, but every sector wants more money. And we can explore ways to bring more money, but I think it's really important to actually use what we have in the sector. And budget execution, there's really no excuse for having that low budget execution. So as George mentioned, we need to look at the public investment management and public financial management to improve the flow of funding in the sector. So I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thank you, Aroha. We'll agree with you too. Well, we are running out of time, so I want to thank George and Aroha particularly for all this effort. I mean, 2 years of heavy lifting on this work. I mean, and definitely this will be a report that will be quite influential to the sector. Definitely, I want to thank Guy Houghton, Sophia Murad, and Pascaline Wanshiku. For all the insights, I mean, and this discussion, I mean, and definitely your guidance on the way forward will be critical for future ventures. Again, I want to encourage everybody to take a look to the report. I mean, this presentation that George and Aroha did is just a brief summary of all the wealth of information that they have over there. So definitely, if you have a chance, go into details, read the footnotes, read all the annexes, that the reach of the report is there. And if you have any question or any suggestion, feel free to reach out to both George and Aroha. I mean, and definitely you will not be disappointed. Again, thanks to all for your participation. I mean, I'm looking forward for having future discussions on the topic. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Congrats.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, man.
So, okay.
I will call you shortly.
Okay.
Okay, bye.